it would be a great game for AJ Storr to show back up the way he did in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. I'm not saying he's going to. I am saying that could be something that could be huge for this team.
Paid all who enter, and beware of this podcast. That's right. This is the Paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, and I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. We are brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible. Member FDIC, and it's Selection Sunday. Selection Sunday. We're recording this immediately after the announcement of the 68-team bracket for March Madness. The madness has officially begun. I don't know if you saw, Kevin. I think it was 14 of the 31 conferences had a non-one seed team win, or 17, I think. 17 of the 31 conferences had a non-one seed win their conference tournament. So it's already begun, and now it begins for real with the NCAA tournament. Win or go home. Win, you advance. Lose, your season is over. And also Kansas had to wait quite a while to hear their name called. They were one of the very final few teams announced on the selection show in the West region as a 7 seed. We talked about it after the Arizona game in the Big 12 tournament. Felt like that was probably where Kansas was going to end up. I mean, I think you and I had talked about the possibility of them getting to a 6 seed, maybe if they were able to win a couple more games in the Big 12 tournament. But a 7 always felt like the most logical scenario for Kansas, and that's where they end up. They end up as a 7 seed in the West region, and they are going to be shipping out to Providence, Rhode Island, to take on the 10 seed in that region is Arkansas. So a draw that, I don't know, I've already seen some people have some mixed reactions to it just immediately, as that'll be Kansas' opening matchup. And this people may have forgotten about this already. Kansas and Arkansas have already played, actually.
Yes.
If you recall, an exhibition game in Fayetteville all the way back in late October, early November, these two teams already have played. And Arkansas was pretty dominant, if you recall, in that scrimmage or in that exhibition game against Kansas. They ended up winning. I don't even remember what the final score was, but they ended up winning it over Kansas. But since then, these are two teams that I think, Kevin, have to a certain extent been a little bit similar this year. I mean, both I think have a lot of talent. Kansas obviously was preseason number 1 overall. Arkansas was preseason top 25, I believe, as well. And they both have kind of fallen into this matchup now with Coach Cal and Bill Self meeting in the NCAA tournament, but not in the second weekend or not at the Final Four. Instead, in the opening weekend as a 7-10 matchup in this one. What was your initial reaction to that draw for Kansas? How do you feel about it, I guess, first and foremost?
First, I have 2 trivia questions for you, and I tweeted both of these out, so don't cheat, and if you've seen it before, you can let me know.
I did not see your tweet. Just for full clarity in advance, I did not see your tweet.
Do you know who led Kansas in scoring in that first matchup with Arkansas?
This feels like a trick question. I'm gonna guess KJ Adams. I don't know.
DeJuan Harris with 26.
I don't remember that at all.
Do you know who Kansas' second leading scorer was?
So I just double down on KJ Adams.
It was Rakese Passmore with 11. Hunter Dickinson did not play in that game, and so I do.
That's right.
That's that's one of those things I'm sure a lot of people are going to bring up. Yes, these two teams have seen each other. Yes, a lot of them have played against each other. I'd expect this game to go a little bit differently. If the top 2 scorers for Kansas are DeJuan Harris and Rakese Passmore, something probably went horrifically wrong in that game. And so I do think it's a fascinating matchup, though, Nick, and I'm glad that you kind of pointed out that these two teams are somewhat similar. I think, too, Arkansas getting Boogie Flan back, which it sounds like that's a big thing for them because Arkansas did not shoot the 3 well this year. And Boogie Flan is a guy that does add that element to them. It's a big addition for them. Not just they brought him up as a depth piece. Obviously, when a guy's been missing for a long time, you don't necessarily expect him to step back in and immediately be what he is, make 5 of 7 threes or something like that in this game. but his shooting could be a key addition for Arkansas. Arkansas, it does sound like, though, will be without Adu Tiero, who obviously, played for Cal at Kentucky, is now with him there at Arkansas. Another key player for Arkansas. It hurts them to be missing him. And so another, potential big guy there that's not there. I think when you look at Kansas's overall sort of picture and you look at Arkansas followed by St. John's, one of the things that should St. John's win its game, should Kansas obviously win its game against Arkansas, one of the things that jumps out is neither of these two teams are extremely perimeter oriented or are great shooting teams. I'm not saying that, hey, Kansas matches up perfectly with either one of them, because I think Arkansas has a dynamic backcourt that, if it plays well, can really give Kansas a lot of issues. You're going to have Zeke Mayo on a guy that he may struggle to defend. You're going to really need Rylan Griffin to step up his defense from where it's at. When Dickie Coit is in, he's not necessarily going to have a place that you can hide him. And so I do think that that's one of the areas that you look at and say, okay, this is an area where Kansas maybe doesn't match up quite as well against a guy like Nelly Davis, against Boogie Fland, against DJ Wagner, all these different guys. I do think, though, that if your first thought was, I don't want to see Kansas against a team that's going to spread Kansas out, that's going to shoot the ball like BYU did, that's going to be able to run away and hide because they make 15-plus threes, neither one of these teams are really that kind of team. And so from that specific aspect, that probably went about as well as Kansas could have asked with these matchups.
First of all, I cannot believe the disrespect for Omaha in this discussion. Man. I cannot believe.
I should have known better.
No, I'm actually going to disrespect the hell out of Omaha, and I don't plan on talking about them at all. So sorry, Omaha. If you're an Omaha fan, I'm sorry. But just to underscore your point on 3-point shooting, Arkansas is 201st in the country in 3-point shooting at 33%. Meanwhile, St. John's, they are statistically a fantastic team, pretty much, especially on defense, but across the board, except for one thing that you talked about, the 3-point shooting. St. John's is 30% as a team from three this season. That is bottom 20 in the country for 3-point shooting. So they really are not a 3-point shooting team at all. And like you said, we've actually seen some games this year where it's felt like Kansas at times was trading 3s versus 2s against their opponents.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be the case more than likely against these two opponents, if they take care of business against Arkansas and they move on and face St. John's. And to further extend what you were talking about there as well with Dickie Coit, we've mentioned it throughout the season, but there are games and matchups where you can tell very immediately that it's just not going to be a game where Dickie Coit's going to be able to be viable for extended minutes. I already get the sense that Arkansas is going to be the case because of some of what they have on their side in terms of size and matchups. So that puts a lot more pressure on DeJuan Harris. I mean, we kind of saw what happened with him where he had a bad game in the Big 12 tournament, and because of matchups, Kansas didn't really have a choice but to roll him out there. The one wild card to that is something else we talked about over the course of the Big 12 tournament, which is Shaq Moore. If he is able to get in position to possibly just give you 5 to 10 minutes, right, on that game against Arkansas, if possible, that's something to keep an eye on as well. But yeah, I think we talked about it from a matchup standpoint. These are two games, Arkansas and then potentially St. John's, if it is St. John's after that. But yeah, I think in some ways favors Kansas because they're not teams that are going to shoot the lights out. They're not teams that are going to rain threes on you and then be able to just sort of bunker down and win the game that way, which gives certainly, I think, me more confidence that Kansas can then hang around against these teams, right? And you look at what Arkansas has done specifically over down the stretch in conference play in the SEC. They had a bad loss against South Carolina at the start of March. They only won one game in the SEC conference tournament. They then lost to Ole Miss, who was also in the NCAA tournament as a 9 seed. But beyond that, they had a nice win against Missouri at home. They beat Texas in overtime, who was in the NCAA tournament as a bubble team. They beat Vanderbilt, who was also in the NCAA tournament. They beat Mississippi State as well by 1 to end the season. So they finished the year winning 4 or 5, but prior to that, they had lost to Auburn, Texas A&M. They lost to Alabama. So down the stretch in SEC play, they won 4, but this is a team that over the course of the season, you look even further back. I mean, in non-conference play, they lost against Baylor. They had a nice win against Michigan. They lost to Illinois as well in non-conference play. By the way, another thing people might forget about Arkansas is they started conference play on a 0-5. They started conference play on a 5-game losing streak against Tennessee, Mississippi, Florida, LSU, and Missouri. So they were able to bounce back and find their way into the NCAA tournament as a 10 seed. Shipping out to Rhode Island to take on Kansas. And one other thing that you mentioned about Boogie Flan, I think that's important to highlight as well, that he more than likely is going to be playing in the NCAA tournament at this point for Arkansas. And one other takeaway, if you remember, from that exhibition game that they played back in before the start of the season, Boogie Flan also had a very strong game in that particular game against Kansas. So if he is playing even close to full strength, it's going to present a tough matchup that KU's going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I think, too, the other thing that, and we may want to talk about this more after the break, but one area where Arkansas is strong as well that really helps the Razorbacks in this game is they've got two pretty good centers. You know, Jonas Adu coming off the bench in the SEC tournament. Zvonimir Ivicic, I realize I probably just butchered that. Ivicic is maybe their best shooter, and at 7'2", and so it's an interesting situation because Adu doesn't shoot, but is kind of the more physical guy, you know, whatever else, and so Hunter Dickinson's going to have two very different assignments depending on which of those guys is in the game. You know, if it's Ivicic, then you got to track that guy, because if he's coming down the court as like a trail guy on a break or whatever else, he's a guy that very capably can make that outside shot. And, you know, he shot, I think 38% from three this year, made almost 50 of them as a 7'2" guy. So that's something you need to keep an eye on. And then when Adu is in, you know, Adu's a guy that scores more on the interior, has taken 7 threes this year, didn't make any of them. And so you're going to have to really pay attention to sort of scouting report defense in this one and not have the quote unquote brain farts that Kansas's defense has had at times this year, where they've left a guy who's a capable shooter, or they haven't, you know, played a guy to take away his strengths. The NCAA tournament, Nick, it's all about execution, and Bill Self is going to give them a really good detailed scouting report, because that's what they always do when they have a full week to prepare for these teams. You get it nailed into your head, this is what you have to do. You still have to go out there and execute it, and that's something that this year's team has kind of struggled with at times. Is I've seen some fans say, like, oh my gosh, are they not telling the players to do? Yes, they're telling the players not to let this guy shoot the ball. It's in the scouting report. It's up to the players to then go out there and execute it. And so, Nick, it's really going to be up to them to kind of keep their head on a swivel, especially defensively, and pay attention to who's in the game, who isn't in the game, and therefore what your responsibilities are because of that.
Let's get into that and much more coming up on the other side of this break. That gives us a chance to tell you about Home Field Apparel. You can shop Home Field Apparel at homefieldapparel.com. Use that promo code PAY24. They just released a new box as well. That's going to get you tons of great gear, including some KU women's basketball gear also. So you want to be supporting your Jayhawks and looking good while doing it, and you can do that at only one place, Home Field Apparel. 40-plus items to choose from at homefieldapparel.com for Kansas. And if you got somebody who's a fan of other school that's maybe in the NCAA tournament, you can get them something from Home Field Apparel as well, as they have over 150 other schools you can choose from, and use that promo code PAYHEAT24 for 15% off your first order. More NCAA tournament breakdown coming up next. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
Success in real estate takes more than vision. It takes the right financial partner. When someone takes something rundown and turns it into something great, that's called a comeback story. Like Bryan Group. They take distressed properties here in KC, completely rework them, and then turn them into valuable real estate. But that kind of work needs the right bank behind it. Enter Emprise Bank. They're not about cookie-cutter loans. They saw Brian Group's vision, backed them, and now they're making big moves in Kansas City real estate. Talk about your partner in possible. Emprise doesn't do one-size-fits-all financing. They invest in potential and back growth. Visit emprisebank.com/KC to learn more. Emprise Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty. If you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN or on your audio platforms, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen, subscribe there as well. Drop a comment, share your thoughts. You can find us on social media at Paid KCSN, at K Flaherty KCSN, at Nick Springer 29. Lots of ways to join in on the conversation and let us know how you're feeling about Kansas's tournament chances here as they end up with a 7 seed. It's the first time in 20 years that they're not a top 4 seed. So in many ways, uncharted territory for Kansas coming into this NCAA tournament as a 7 seed against Arkansas. Presumptively, they would face St. John's, the 2 seed in the second round. Rick Pitino's done a great job turning the program around. Zuby Ejiofor has been a big part of that as well. So in this era of the transfer portal, it feels like more likely than not, you're going to be facing a guy that maybe was either on your team or you recruited or you had, something one way or the other. And it's going to happen here with I guess I shouldn't say it's going to happen. It potentially could happen if Kansas beats Arkansas and ends up matching up against St. John's in the second round.
Yeah, it's a fascinating matchup. And, I've already had some Kansas fans kind of reach out and ask me, okay, who's the equivalent for St. John's that KU would have faced? And St. John's shares a lot with Houston. Defensively, they're about the same. St. John's is a terrific offensive rebounding team. And I think that's the thing that maybe worries you a little bit, Nick, is we've already seen what Kansas looked like against Houston on 48 hours rest when Kansas played Texas Tech, then went down to Houston, and Houston won that game. Kansas did hang around in that game, but ultimately the Jayhawks were kind of undone down the stretch, couldn't keep Houston off the glass. Fatigue, it felt like, was a factor in that game for sure. St. John's is going to be able to trouble Kansas in a lot of the same ways. And to our point earlier, if you were watching, it's not necessarily a situation where St. John's is probably going to come out and hit a whole bunch of threes and you're having to work through it. You may be around in this game and maybe around in the final 5 minutes, but that's also a situation where Kansas, more often than not in those situations, I feel like, Nick, has been found wanting, whereas St. John's, a lot like Houston, has kind of been one of those teams that has found a way to win down the stretch. They've executed, they've out-toughed people, and so even if you are in a game where it's really close there at the end, I do think that that's a game that could wind up favoring St. John's ultimately. And so really tough second round matchup, but when you're getting a 2 seed for your second round matchup, going to face a team that's really tough.
St. John's, by the way, they're number 1 in Ken Palmer defense. They jumped number 1. So pretty impressive stuff there from them.
I think they're like 0.03 points per possession better than Houston, which is number 2. So yeah, they're pretty much identical defensively in terms of, and they do it differently. They defend differently, but at the same time, they get to kind of the same end product on both sides.
Arkansas, by the way, is 20th in Ken Palmer on defense, 73rd in offense. So kind of circling back to that discussion about the 3-point shooting, like I don't think this is a game where Kansas is going to have to worry about trying to keep up with their opponent, right? Whether against Arkansas and then even going forward into the St. John's game as well. This is not going to be a game where KU's going to have to worry about scoring a lot of points to keep up, which, again, I would think favors or gives Kansas, I shouldn't say favors Kansas, but I think makes you feel a little bit better about Kansas's chances because that probably puts them into a situation where they're going to be within striking distance probably for, I don't expect the game against Arkansas to be one-sided really. And I would say the same thing about if Kansas advances to take on St. John. So that means that you're going to be in it late in games. And, we've seen Kansas struggle to execute late in games, but we've seen them also in some games where they're playing from the lead, hang on to it. Most notably the Arizona game, they played it out at Allen Fieldhouse as well. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. And you kind of mentioned it in terms of the matchups, right? So if we're just going to extrapolate Kansas being a 7 seed, you look at kind of the other regions of the bracket. So you look at the South region, it's Marquette as the 7 against New Mexico, with Michigan State as the 2. I think I'd probably rather play Arkansas than New Mexico. New Mexico has maybe one of the best point guards in the country, and they've been really strong this year. You look at the other region, it's St. Mary's as the 7, Vanderbilt's the 10, with Alabama as the 2. I think collectively, Kansas, you wanted to avoid Alabama because Alabama is the complete opposite of what we've been talking about with St. John's and Arkansas, in which they're going to score 100 points if they can. They're going to try to, and that's probably a team that you are happy that you don't see them in the second round. And in the Midwest region, it's UCLA is the 7, Utah State is the 10, with Tennessee is the 2. We had talked, I think, on the show, and you and I have talked about it as well, I think off there also, about the prospect of playing Tennessee and how Tennessee maybe is a team that on paper looks kind of scary because of their physicality, but might not have their offensively by the time you play them in a second game of a weekend. So that's an interesting one. But I think overall, I mean, you probably like the draw that Kansas got when you look around the rest of the bracket in terms of who they could have gotten in that 7-10 and 2-15 range.
Yeah, I think if you had a perfect scenario, you probably would have wanted Utah State as your 10 rather than Arkansas, I would think. But it was probably fairly close between those two. I didn't want to see Drake as KU's 10 in Missouri. Yeah. And Missouri gets Drake as an 11. So I mean that was not fun for the Tigers. Everybody, who are Kansas fans, really upset that the Missouri Tigers got Drake as their 11. But no, and then if you were picking the top, 2s that you would have wanted to face, I think it probably would have been Tennessee or St. John's. That doesn't mean Kansas is going to beat either one of them. Actually, Michigan State probably would have been my dream too.
Yeah.
Because you've beaten them. I like that matchup. That probably would have been my number 1. But as it shook out, I think there were a few 10s that I really wouldn't have wanted to see. Alabama was the 2 I really wouldn't have wanted to see because Kansas doesn't control the pace that other teams play with. We've talked about that on our show, where Kansas kind of plays at the pace that the other team plays at. Your second game in 48 hours, you don't want to be playing a 105 to 102 game against the team that's trying to make 23s in that game. That's not what you really want. And so avoiding Alabama, I feel like that was kind of your worst case scenario from a 2 standpoint, would have been Alabama.
Yeah, I agree. I think any other 2 seed, it's you're playing with house money at that point, really, besides Alabama. I think with this team, when it comes to expectations in this tournament, I think we've touched on it a little bit down the stretch in the season. But number 1, I think, is certainly win your first round game against Arkansas. I think beyond that, though, it's kind of just anything on beyond that is just kind of gravy. And I don't mean that to sound like, oh, this is the expectation, because obviously it wasn't. The expectation was Kansas was going to be a top 4 seed like they've always been, and they were preseason number 1. But considering how this season has gone, I think you do have to reset a little bit heading in the NCAA tournament and acknowledge, where Kansas is at and what the expectations of this tournament should be, which is you're a 7 seed. That means the expectations are you win your first game against the lower seeded team and then you lose against the 2 seed, right? And I think if that happens, it just kind of is what it is. If you make it the second weekend, fantastic. Beyond that, but that's kind of where I'm at. Like, losing against Arkansas, I will be disappointed. If you win that game and you play a good game against St. John's and maybe you don't win, I'll be fine, whatever. And if you win against St. John's and make the second weekend, even better. And beyond that, it's just anything beyond that is going to be great because, we've touched on it, but this team, this roster, I mean, in the era of the NIL and transfer portal, this is going to be a vastly, vastly different team in 2026 or 2025-26. It's going to be vastly different for a wide variety of reasons. You're going to be DeJuan Harris and KJ Adams will be off the team as well as Hunter Dickinson. You're bringing in one of the best players in a generation in Darren Peterson. So it's going to be a very different team. So with that in mind, I think you hope that this team can come together and make a run in this NCAA tournament. If they don't, then it will probably be a product of what we've seen all season. It probably will be the reason why they don't do that, because this is definitely a flawed team that we have outlined quite a bit. But in the NCAA tournament, you get good matchups that don't expose your flaws, you can make a run.
Yeah, and this is a team that has shown that it can play with the top teams in the country on a one-off basis, right? And that's always been the thing with this team, Nick. We've said on the show, I feel like we're, beating the same thing over and over with a hammer, and it's not even a dead horse anymore because, like, the horse is, like, disintegrated. It's just empty where the horse used to be, and we're still hitting the spot where the horse used to be. But we didn't believe in this team's chance to win 6 games in a row because the biggest issue was a lack of consistency. But we've also said all along, this is a team that can play with and beat just about anybody on a one-off basis. This is a team that should have beaten Houston at Allen Fieldhouse and outplayed Houston when they played them at Allen Fieldhouse. This is a team that beat Arizona at Allen Fieldhouse, that was right there with Arizona heading into the final 5 minutes. They were right there with Houston in the final 5 minutes, heading into the end of that game at Houston, which is one of the most difficult places to play in the entire country right now. Kansas beat Duke. Kansas beat Michigan State. And I realize those teams, continue to improve over the course of the season. I'm just saying this is a team that on a one-off, Nick, this is a team that can beat St. John's. They can. That's not saying they're going to do it. It's just saying that, hey, this is a team that on one night, if you're getting St. John's and the right KU team shows up, it's a team that can beat St. John's. It's also a team that's capable of losing to Arkansas. And so I think that's the interesting thing. And I love, the point you always make about Diggy Coit is you can tell really early on, whether you're getting good Diggy, if it's a good night for Diggy or a bad night. This is a KU team that, has kind of been an extension of that, and that you can tell a lot of times pretty quickly, like if you're getting the good version of this KU team or the bad version. Unfortunately, they've even shown over the course of games that you can get both over the course of 40 minutes. And so I think to your point about expectations and everything, I'm right there with you in that I think you would feel really disappointed if you lost to Arkansas. And that's not a knock on Arkansas. It's a tough first-round matchup. It really is, and Arkansas is really talented. But you would feel bad about that, and Kansas hasn't lost in the first round, and I am knocking on wood. Since 2006 was the last time. So you would hate to have that end, because as much as everybody wants to bring up KU making every NCAA tournament from 1990 on, I almost feel like that streak of winning a game every single NCAA tournament for 20 years is maybe even more impressive. And so you'd hate to see that end. If you wind up getting run off the rails by St. John's like you did with Gonzaga last year, that would also be really disappointing, I think. Yeah. So it's not necessarily, hey, just win one and you're not disappointed. But if you win one against Arkansas and then you compete with St. John's, you almost get like an as expected, right? Like you're not really ticked off about the way the tournament went. You're not really happy about it either. If you beat St. John's, that's when you're kind of like, okay, this, you're playing with house money at that point, and you're in a situation where you're also looking at it and you're saying you're 2 games from a Final Four, no matter what happened to get to that point. And as we saw with NC State, as we saw with FAU, a few years back, anything can happen in those couple games. And so all of a sudden you're in a spot where I think there is a little bit of optimism that you would be able to potentially win another game, and then you're 40 minutes away from the Final Four, especially with the other teams that are in that bracket. If you knock off St. John's, I think you would feel like you'd have a decent shot in a Sweet 16 game. But before you even get there, you got to beat Arkansas, and that's going to be a tough one. We talked about the center matchups for Hunter Dickinson, the fact that, hey, you get one of those guys in foul trouble, and Arkansas still has a pretty good center to put in there. It is a pretty nice advantage. Arkansas is tall. They play Trevon Brazile at the 4, and he's a really good shot blocker. And so it's not the easiest thing to get shots when he's the guy off the ball and contest shots as well. He's also one of their better shooters. So when they put in Brazile and Ivicic together, they have a 4 and a 5 who both can shoot from the outside. I do think KJ Adams has a chance to attack Brazil's body and maybe do some things. What really fascinates me is Arkansas is also big at the 2 and the 3 with Nelly Davis and Carter Knox, which means that at least theoretically, it would be a great game for AJ Storr to show back up the way he did in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. I'm not saying he's going to. I am saying that could be something that could be huge for this team. Not that they're going to get 15 from AJ Storr, but if this could be one of those games that he can play 10 minutes and get you 7 points, that could be the difference between you moving on or you going home. And the other part is where's Rylan Griffin's head at? If he defends that 3 well and he makes a few shots, you're probably going to be in a pretty good place as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. I also had something else I wanted to bring up with you, and then we'll maybe take a bigger picture look at the entire bracket as well.
Yep.
I mean, this is a KU show, obviously, but I know, Kevin, you watch maybe more college basketball than anybody I know, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on some of sort of the rest of the bracket. So we'll get into that and a little bit more coming up after this quick break.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network. Make sure you download our new app. Find it on the App Store or Google Play. Just search KC Sports Network.
This is the Payton Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty. Before we go into a little bit deeper, maybe the rest of the bracket, one other point I did want to mention as we were sort of talking about the expectations for the tournament and maybe this Kansas team, I just wonder if the possibility of a lack of expectations for this team not heading in the NCAA tournament acts as sort of a freeing mechanism for these guys.
Sure.
Maybe the weight of expectations was weighing on these guys pretty heavily throughout the season. Maybe with that sort of not as heavy on them, considering where they're at, helps free them up a little bit to play a little bit more free and loose in this tournament potentially. I don't know. It's hard to say. I loved what you said earlier about pretty early on. We'll probably tell whether or not this team is still feeling a lot of pressure or not when they take the floor against Arkansas. So that'll be something to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of funny when Kansas got just absolutely run in the first half against North Carolina. If you don't know, Bill Self's speech at halftime to those guys was actually kind of funny. He kind of came in and said, like, you guys had a chance to be remembered as legends, but I screwed that up now. Like nobody's going to remember you positive. And it wasn't quite that bad, but it was basically like you guys had a chance and man, you blew it. Like you're getting run out of the gym. Like everybody's going to remember that about you. And you think about the way they came out in that second half and the energy that they played with and how free they were in that second half, especially, over the first 8-10 minutes or whatever of that half before both teams kind of started trading shots back and forth. And I think a similar tactic wouldn't be the worst for Bill Self, just sort of saying, hey guys, like we went into this thing preseason number 1. That's done. We got a 7 seed. Like nobody believes in you. People barely talked about you on the selection show. It was there were words even uttered about you. Nobody expects anything from you. And, not necessarily as a, hey, let's get mad and fired up about this, but more as a, there's nothing expected from you at this point. Just go out and play free basketball and have a good time. And I do agree with you that can be kind of a freeing mechanism a little bit. It's kind of funny. Tom Izzo gets, such great kudos for being a fantastic March coach. And I'm not saying he's a bad March coach, but we've typically seen when Izzo is at his best in March, a lot of times is when he doesn't have his best teams. And they're teams that people don't expect, a lot from. Dale Brown, when he was at LSU, I don't think he reached the Sweet 16 with Shaquille O'Neal on his team. But he had other Final Four teams that weren't nearly as highly regarded. And so there is a world where you have a really highly regarded team. You've got a high seed. There's so much expectation. And you come out and play like it. There's a weight on your shoulders. And you're almost just swimming to survive. I think that Bill Self would be very smart to tap into what you're talking about and just sort of saying, look, like the expectations aren't there for you guys. You know, if you lose to Arkansas, nobody's going to bat an eye. And so basically go out and say to him, yeah, you're free. You know, execute, do the things that you've been taught, you know, do the scouting report, but go out and have fun knowing that there's no pressure on you to do anything. And maybe that is something that unlocks this team a little bit.
We spent a lot of time talking about Kansas's first matchup against Arkansas, plus what they could be seeing potentially in the second round. When you look at the rest of the region, we touched on it with Missouri being a 6 and drawing Drake as an 11. That is pretty brutal for them. Texas Tech is also in the region as a 3 against UNC Wilmington. You have Maryland as a 4. Memphis, Colorado State is the 5-12 matchup. This is, of course, Florida's region, who's the 1. Oklahoma gets in as a 9 seed. And you could potentially have UConn and Florida matching up in the second round, which is something that could be really exciting in this region. When you look at the rest of the bracket, Kevin, what stood out to you? What were some of the surprises, some matchups maybe that you're excited about just from the college basketball fandom standpoint? If you're like us and you're going to be getting into your bracket bunker with 4 or 5 TVs loaded up, what games have you most intrigued? What games are you putting on the main screen?
Yeah, I really like Texas Tech in the West. I think, you know, it's a team that they have a really good idea of what they are. You know, they're probably going to be a little bit healthier than they have been recently. And so I like that part of it. That potential Houston-Gonzaga second round matchup is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Because for those of you who don't know, like Gonzaga has reached the Sweet 16, I feel like every year since Lincoln was president. It's a really long streak. And to have to go through Houston, if they even get there, I mean, they got Georgia, Georgia's been a little bit of a giant killer this year and is more than capable of knocking Gonzaga off. But at the same time, a Gonzaga-Houston second-round matchup just seems absolutely outrageous for at that time in the tournament. And I realize Gonzaga hasn't been perfect this year, but they've also had some moments where they've looked like a darn good basketball team. And so that was one that kind of caught my attention. I like Florida overall, Nick. Like, I don't know how much you've gotten a chance to watch the Gators. They just seem like such a complete team right now. And when you look at whoever's coming out of that bottom part of the West, and I would probably have Texas Tech there, you know, I think that Florida could be the team that's playing the best heading into the NCAA tournament. And so they've got a pretty good chance to roll through. Louisville getting an 8 didn't seem like didn't seem like super fun. And then getting Creighton as your 9, Creighton's A game is pretty darn good too. And so that was another one that kind of jumped out at me. The other one from like an upset standpoint, because like 12s, you know, and 5s happen like every year, as you know. UC San Diego is interesting to me in that game against Michigan. I really like Michigan. Michigan's a team I did not want Kansas to match up with, but UC San Diego is also a team that I would not have wanted to see. And then I just think that when you look at some of those 6-11 matchups too, sorry, I have bad eyesight, so I'm kind of squinting. The Drake Missouri game stands out to me, obviously. And then the other one was
BYU VCU, I think.
Yeah,
going to be a fun one.
Was kind of a fun one too. And then was it Detroit? Sorry, I hate like getting like all up on my thing. No, I actually think UC San Diego's got a chance to maybe do some damage to your bracket. What jumped out to you, like in terms of? I know you were saying you thought Auburn got kind of a raw deal with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, Auburn ends up with Louisville and Creighton as their 8 and their 9, and I don't know, when you look at the other 8-9 matchups, like Gonzaga and Houston is one that I think you could look at and say, okay, Houston got a pretty tough draw if that ends up being a lose. But I mean, Florida's going to get either UConn or a bad Oklahoma team. The other 8-9 is Baylor, Mississippi State, who's probably going to get Duke. Like it feels like Louisville, Creighton is the best chance of getting a good team that you're going to face in the second round. So I feel like Auburn kind of got maybe screwed from that standpoint. To tap onto the end of your discussion with UC San Diego, this is their first year D1.
Yeah.
Like they feel, you want to talk about a team that feels absolutely primed to be like the Cinderella team. It's UC San Diego in their first year in D1 and they make a run. It just seems like it would be poetic if that were to happen. Yale is also a team I'm interested in. If you watch the Ivy League tournament, they had a pretty good tournament. They got Texas A&M. I think that's a pretty winnable game for Yale. So you could be looking at that region. That's the South region where a 12 and a 13 both advance with UC San Diego and Yale. I think that's something that caught my eye. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion as well about the last teams in the tournaments. West Virginia was the last team out. The NCAA committee guys on the selection show afterwards talked about how the American Conference Championship game determined whether or not West Virginia was going to be in. They basically said if Memphis won over UAB, Memphis was in, North Carolina was in. If UAB had managed to win over Memphis, it would have been West Virginia, or it would have knocked North Carolina out and West Virginia in. So I think West Virginia probably deserved to be in over North Carolina. North Carolina 1-12 in quad one. Texas also snuck in as well as one of the last four in. They're in the playing game against Xavier. So I don't know. There's a lot of conversation to be had there about,
West Virginia is tough too because they had so many injuries and, obviously, DeVries wasn't going to play in the tournament and hadn't played, all year or whatever after, playing like the first 8 games. But you had a game or two in there missed by Hansberry. You had some other guys missing games too. And so it felt like there were some extenuating circumstances. And even then, I feel like West Virginia was better against top competition kind of than UNC was. But, West Virginia had a win over Kansas, obviously at Allen Fieldhouse. Yeah. Beat Arizona in a non-conference game. Beat Gonzaga, beat Iowa State. It feels like West Virginia should have been rewarded for those games, and unfortunately, ultimately wasn't.
SEC got 14 teams in, by the way, which
new record.
Yeah, it's a new record by 3 teams. I think the previous record was 11. So they not only did they set a record, I'm assuming 14 will never ever be hit again. I would think,
unless we do wind up going to these major conferences where
if it's like super conferences
teams, exactly.
Yeah. The Big 12 ended up with 7. So you have Kansas, Texas Tech, who we talked about being in the same region as KU. You also had, let's see here, who else? I'm trying to scroll through. Iowa State with a 3 seed against Lipscomb in the South region. You also had Arizona as a 4 seed. Baylor got in as a 9 seed against Mississippi State. BYU as the 6 seed against VCU, a game we touched on earlier. And I'm trying to see. Don't think anybody. Oh, and then Houston, obviously, in the Midwest, is the 1 seed. So Big 12 is pretty well represented, I think, in this tournament. We'll see how they do. Houston, obviously, I think is the team that has the best chance. But Texas Tech, like you mentioned, is one that I think you got to be excited about. Iowa State, man,
had a kind of a tough path. BYU did, I thought.
Yeah, a lot of people
like BYU's path to reach the Elite Eight, and I'm not saying they can't get there, but I actually think Wisconsin's kind of a tough second round matchup for BYU, honestly, because Wisconsin can hit outside shots and takes a whole bunch of them too. So both of them, I think, take 48% of their shots from behind the arc.
Yeah, I'm just hesitant to pick a team like that to make a deep run that is maybe so reliant on one specific thing, like 3-point shooting, because
these shots for all 6 games. I mean, even that 2018 Villanova team, I think, went like 3 for 21 against Texas Tech in the Elite Eight.
Yeah,
you do not hit outside shots for all 6 games. It just doesn't happen.
So those teams like BYU, who obviously was really hot from 3 in the Big 12 tournament, those types of teams, I think, draw everyone's attention in, and they think, oh man, if BYU can shoot like this, they're going to make a deep run. And then they get to the round of 32 and they have a bad shooting night and they look terrible and they lose.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm not too keen on those types of teams that are maybe so reliant on that. I think a team like Alabama is a good example. They can score from the outside and score in a lot of other ways as well. But certain teams, I think, are too reliant on it.
Yeah, and I think with Alabama, it's the other interesting thing about the Crimson Tide is the pace of play slows a lot in the NCAA tournament. You don't get out and run as much. Obviously, Alabama wants to get out and run and have that thing be 100-90. That's the pace that Alabama wants to play at. But teams are a lot better at executing, and they're a lot better at playing their style of basketball, and so Alabama is going to run into somebody. I'm not saying that Alabama won't reach the Final Four or won't play well, but they're going to reach somebody that's not going to allow them to play at 100 versus 90 type pace. And so they're going to try and push that tempo and whatever else. But, how are they going to be when somebody is turning it more into a 65-60 type game? They may still win it. They're a really good team, but I do think that that's something to be factored in, as well as that teams do a pretty good job of especially making fast teams play quite a bit slower in the tournament. They make sure that you don't get as many runouts as you might normally get.
Kevin, we can't leave this show without making some predictions. I mean, it's the NCAA tournament. Come on, man. We got to make some predictions. I'm gonna let's put you on the spot here. I know you got your bracket pulled up.
All right.
Let's go.
You can tell it's up because I'm squinting, trying really hard to see it.
Let's go with some Final Four picks here. Who do you like? Who do you like to make the Final Four?
All right, I like Florida out of the West. I probably like. I hate keeping picking ones, but and I think Auburn's got a tough second round matchup, but ultimately, like, there's nobody else in that bracket that I really love. Like, Michigan State is the 2, right? Like,
yeah,
I think I'd pick Auburn there too. I actually think Duke could wind up in a couple matchups that could be troublesome for Duke. I do like BYU to make a little bit of a run. How much fun, by the way, would a BYU Alabama Sweet 16 be?
That would be chaos.
That would be absolutely fantastic. And so I think I'll probably pick Alabama out of the East as a 2 seed. And then it's so tough for me to pick against Houston because I like that team. I like how tough they are. I like, the way they're cut and everything. 3 number 1 seeds probably won't happen, but that's what I'm going is 3 1s and a 2, just because unlike a lot of years, I feel like there are super dangerous teams on that 2 and 3 line where you really circle them and say, okay, this team's going a really long way. I actually think the 1 seeds, maybe there aren't as many of those teams that feel like major threats. How about you? Let's put the spotlight on you. You won't be squinting because you're wearing your glasses, but what are your picks?
Well, you mentioned it with the 2 and 3 seeds. Like, yeah, you got Michigan State and Iowa State there. You got Wisconsin as a 3. Yeah, I don't know. Then you got like Tennessee and Kentucky as a 2 and a 3. Like St. John's is a 2. That's a fun story, but like, are they really going to make a deep run? I don't know. Just to be a little bit different, I'm going to go Texas Tech, like my 3 seed out of the West region. In the Midwest, that's Houston's region. Yeah, I mean, it is really hard to pick against Houston. Purdue, I think, is somewhat intriguing. We'll see, but they get the fighting Bobby Pettifords in round 1, so be on the lookout for that one. I'm gonna go Houston, I guess. And then in the East, I like Alabama. I like Alabama. I think with Cooper Flagg's injury, I know he's on track to return, but you wonder about that with Duke. I'm gonna go with Alabama. And then, yeah, you look at the South region, and I kind of mentioned earlier that I felt that it was a kind of a tough draw for Auburn, but it's a tough draw. But simultaneously, I have a hard time envisioning any of these other teams like making a run.
There's a non-zero chance, Nick, that Auburn gets UC San Diego or Yale in the Sweet 16.
Agree.
And so it's one of those where it's like Auburn will probably has a chance to have maybe the toughest second round matchup of the 1 seeds, although Houston Gonzaga certainly could be that as well. But then there's also a chance that Auburn could have, at least theoretically, the easiest Sweet 16 matchup too, because of the potential upsets in that round.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Like I said, I think UC San Diego and Yale could easily be the round of 32 game in that 12-13 region. So I'll go Auburn. So that gives me Auburn, Texas Tech, Houston, and Bama. So 2 SEC teams, 2 Big 12 teams. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's kind of right. I get the sense I know what your answer might be, but you may surprise me. You named your Final Four. Who do you think is going to be cutting the nets down? Who's hoisting the national championship?
I think it's Florida. I think that Florida's playing it as well as anybody. I love Houston, and I think that Houston's kind of X factor in all of this is just the way that Houston rebounds and the way they turn people over. They're going to get more shots than the other teams most of the time. And so that helps them. Even if you get Houston on a bad shooting night, they're still going to rebound 40% of their misses. So you're just, it is what it is. But I'm not sure there's another team in the country playing better than Florida right now. I think they've got the guard play. They've got the size and the ability to bang with people down low. They aren't overly reliant on shooting it from the outside well. And so I think that they can win in a variety of ways as well. And so I tend to like Florida for this one. Walter Clayton, I think, has a chance to have a really big tournament as well.
I thought you were going to pick Houston, to be honest.
Yeah, it's tough for me to not pick Houston, but now I think Florida is playing terrifically well. It hurt me to pick against Houston. You should know that. And honestly, I love your pick of Texas Tech in the Final Four because I very much think that that's a possibility. And if the Red Raiders are healthy, obviously in the Big 12 tournament, you had them missing a guy or two. If the Red Raiders are healthy, they're as good as anybody. They're really dangerous. They know who they are. They're tough. They execute down the stretch. I really like Texas Tech as a Final Four pick, honestly.
Yeah, and listen, if nobody's going to stick up for the Houston Cougars, I guess I will.
There it is.
I'll pick Houston. The times that I've seen them play, they can out-tough you. They can absolutely maul you. They are very aggressive, as you outlined on the offensive glass. I think they'll find a way to get it down. I think it might be Houston, and I think Kelvin Sampson is a deserving coach, really.
Yeah,
of that. In this era of college basketball, something that's not really talked about enough is in this era of college basketball, with a lot of coaches retiring, there aren't that many national championship coaches still coaching right now. Like you basically have it's like Tom Izzo, Bill Self, Calipari, and Dan Hurley. Does Rick Pitino count because they got stripped of theirs? I don't know, but yeah. So you don't have very many. You don't have very many national championship coaches still coaching, and I think one guy that doesn't have one that deserves it is Kelvin Sampson.
Pitino's 96 didn't get stripped though.
Oh, true. Okay, yeah. Well, listen, that was before I was born, so kryptonite.
Now you're just putting hate in my heart by saying things like that. So, I was in high school then, so yeah. That hurts me. That hurts me.
Let's bookend this show with circling back to Kansas, and I'll just ask you this: how far do you think this team will go? They got Arkansas. They'll more than likely face St. John's. If they make the Sweet 16, you're looking at probably Texas Tech, or maybe I guess it could be Drake or Missouri. But how far do you think this team will go in the NCAA tournament? Let's hear it now. Bold prediction. How far do you think they go?
Yeah, I think they've got a really tough first-round matchup, but I do ultimately think that they find a way. Bill Self has done a tremendous job. We mentioned on this show preparing for odd-numbered rounds when he has sort of that week to pour into his team of this is how we will play this one specific opponent that you have that much time to prepare for. And so I like them to beat Arkansas. Ultimately, I think St. John's may just have a little too much gas in their legs compared to KU in that second round matchup. I see it going a little bit like the matchup with Houston did when KU went to Houston after playing Texas Tech. Also on that, second game in 3 days type situation. And in that game, if you remember, like KU hung around. KU was right there at the end of that game, but Houston is a team that, that they will bite through nails to beat you at the end of games, and they will execute to beat you at the end of games. I see a lot of similarities with St. John's from that respect too. I think they're a very tough team, a very mentally tough team. They're terrifically coached by Rick Pitino, who's as good as any coach in college basketball right now from a strictly X's and O's standpoint. Ultimately, I think this is another season that probably ends in the round of 32, excuse me. But Nick, I do think that they're probably going to hang around with St. John's. I just ultimately think St. John's probably gets over the top of them at the very end.
Yeah, I feel similarly at this point. It feels wrong to predict that Kansas would lose in the first round against Arkansas. I think they will probably find a way to get that one done. But then kind of what you outlined it, I worry that St. John's may just overwhelm Kansas late if that's the matchup in the round of 32 where, like you said, Kansas may very well hang around late, but will that late game execution be there for Kansas to get it done? I don't know. It's hard to say. So I kind of am in the similar boat as you. I feel like we're looking at probably another round of 32 exit for Kansas, which would be, again, from a big picture standpoint, disappointing considering where Kansas is entering into the tournament. Probably a fair prediction, probably a fair assessment of what they might do, considering where they're at right now. But yeah, it would be disappointing for sure. It would be very disappointing for sure. And hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully we're both wrong, and we'll be talking about this team in the second weekend. But time will tell on that. So
I just know personally, though, Nick, why we're calling that game a revenge game for Zuby Ejiofor and not for AJ Storr.
Yeah, was he at St. John's?
AJ Storr started his college career at St. John's, then went to and is now at Kansas. So it could be hashtag AJ Storr SSN, AJ Storr season. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, AJ Storr played his first year at St. John.
So there you go. You heard it here first. It is not the Zuby revenge game. It's the AJ Storr revenge game. It all comes back to one man, AJ Storr. It all comes back to one man, AJ Storr. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Paid Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, hearing us talk about the NCAA tournament, about where Kansas is at, and so on and so forth. We're going to also have some KU football content coming out from the spring. We'll be doing another position breakdown early this week, so be on the lookout for that on your podcast feeds and on our YouTube channel. And then certainly be on the lookout for us discussing the NCAA tournament going forward here with Kansas, as they'll be taking on Arkansas in the opening round. Be on the lookout later in the week for our show talking about that. Due to some scheduling issues, we may not be going live like we want to post-game on our YouTube channel, but we'll certainly have those shows post those games or game, I guess, if Kansas loses against Arkansas, however far they go. So certainly be on the lookout for that. Keep your notification bells on so you get notified when our shows are out. And be on the lookout for all great content relating to the NCAA tournament in Kansas and also Kansas spring football, because we're going to be moving forward with more of our position breakdowns going forward also.
Baseball series win too, Nick.
Yep. Baseball took down Baylor 2-1. They lost today. They lost on Sunday. But they got two big wins to start the weekend. Dominic Vagley was fantastic. It's almost as if Dan Fitzgerald, Kevin, knows what he's talking about. If you recall, in our interview with him last week heading into this conference season, I asked him about Dom Bagley, and he almost scoffed. He was like, I am not worried about Dominic Bagley at all. And he was right. He was right. He had no reason to be worried. He went out and pitched 7 innings and was fantastic on Friday night for Kansas to win that game against Baylor. So, yeah, KU gets a series win in Big 12 play to start it against Baylor. That's big for them as well. So that's exciting also. So be on the lookout for all great content coming your way throughout the rest of this, however much remains of this Kansas basketball season, KU football spring season as well. We're talking plenty of that and more. So thanks so much for tuning in. As always, if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Subscribe on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN and on our audio platforms, wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple or Spotify. Leave some feedback, share your thoughts, let us know how we're doing. Let us know what you think about KU basketball's chances, KU football, anything that's on your mind. You can comment, you can reach out however you want and let us know. So, but until next time, it's NCAA tournament season. Enjoy the madness and have a great time with it. But he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.